In less than 5 hours of talking about Rome, from its beginnings to the 17th century, let me show you what you're going to see. This is the earliest, to come back to in a moment, and about this is the latest. Now, that's a lot to cover in 5 classes. So we'll see what happens. But this church, for those of you who've been in Rome, is this a familiar one to anyone? It's on a small street. It's San Carlo a Quattro Fontana, 17th century church. First one ever designed by this guy who had been himself in background, just a bricklayer in the interior, or its dome. So we're covering a lot of territory. This is Rome at its peak, 2nd century CE. Rome was the first Western city to reach a population of over 1 million. And Rome, and then it took until London in 1800 before there was something again as large. Now you could hear that plenty, right? How do we know that this is what Rome looked like? By the most astonishing circumstance that there was carved into marble a whole, essentially, ground plan of the city in the beginning of the 3rd century. And it was put up on the wall of an office building in the Roman Forum. And there are just fragments left. But there are a number of fragments that can be said. Archaeologists have been able to say, well, that's this area or this area. So we know it's not a phantasm. You get some idea of how congested the city would be when you look at those small rooms, narrow streets, inner spaces. There's a temple toward the top there that you're looking at. Rome at its peak in the 2nd century was so densely inhabited that they had to pass an ordinance that during the day, it's all foot traffic and all wheel traffic is during the night. So you had to learn to sleep through a lot of sound, but the streets just couldn't accommodate both. So we'll start at the beginning of the beginning. Now, I brought my pointer, but don't know what I did with my pointer. I'm going to have to assume that you know where Rome is then. Down middle to the far left. And Rome's history goes back to myths, and so disentangling what's historical from what's mythological is a problem that still exercises many minds. But it was just a small gathering at a bend in the Tiber River, which you see there, a low point in the Tiber. So that, well, you know that great cities, they're all built on water because water was the one most expeditious means of transportation that you didn't have to build the road, you didn't have to have the same kind of military or police vigilance if you had things in transport, and you can move more quickly by water. So ships would cross the Mediterranean, and then things would be unloaded in Ostia, and then they would go in shallow draft boats and get up here as far as Rome. And where Rome is, there's a real dip in the landscape. So it's a kind of a natural harbor. And that's really why the city grew at that spot. Now, this is a high point in the city now. Of course, that's the Palatine Hill. Until I was doing this, studying for this myself, I did not know that our word palace, palatial, anything with palace, comes from the name of this hill. It's not that the hill's name comes because this is where the first emperors had their palaces, but all the subsequent use of that word comes from this site, overlooking the Roman Forum as you see it now. And crowning it is a 17th century Farnese palace with Farnese gardens, as painted by Corot. So we're going to try to cover a lot of territory. And this territory is especially important. This is on the Palatine Hill, and you just see some holes in the rock. If you follow the contours of them sometimes, it becomes apparent that these are holes for posts. And it's thought that this is the outline of a hut. Well, I'll just say something about the hut first. That can't really date it 10th, 9th century BCE. There's not artifacts around to help date it any more closely right now. But when it was found, this is where the founder of Rome lived. This is the Casa Romuli, the house of Romulus. Because the mythical story of the founding of Rome actually goes back to Greek myths, well elaborated by the 5th century BCE, about one escapee from Troy named Aeneas, who fled with his son and his grandfather. And then they wandered the Mediterranean. His wife didn't even make it out of the city. They wandered over the Mediterranean for years, their adventures in Carthage. And then Aeneas landed, presumably coming up the Tiber, landing in the site of Rome and settling there. Now, at this time, there was a more flourishing culture just slightly to the north, the Etruscan culture. And there must have been some intermingling, supposedly he did there. Part of the story next I don't remember, but ancient Roman historians then thought, well, Aeneas sired a line of kings, 7 kings, and they had the names of the kings, and they thought they had the exact date when Rome was founded in 753 BC. But it doesn't accord with, archaeological evidence. There's been something on the site from long before that, and there had to have been many more kings. But the last king was supposedly a very evil king. His offspring were twins, Romulus and Remus, who were settled here on the hill and the Palatine. I didn't even look up the circumstances of the next event, which is that Romulus killed Remus. The evil king had abandoned the 2 boys, just left them, and a she-wolf found them and suckled them in a cave and raised them. So have you ever heard of someone saying, who are you, raised by a wolf? That you're so uncouth? Oh, that's the source of this. But then a shepherd found them and took them in, and they grew up, and these boys fought, and Romulus killed Remus. So then there was just a solitary, strong figure, and he took his plow, and he plowed a great furrow around a sort of a circular expanse and said, within this is city and is protected by the gods. Outside this is ager, from which we get the word agriculture. That's the wild land. So that's the founding myth. This one farmer who had a ferocious, essentially military character. And Rome forever prided itself, ancient Rome, on being a strong, militant, military, strategic, capable force. So when these, from sometime very early on, it was thought that this is all happening on the Palatine Hill. And then in the 19th century, they did excavations and they found this and said, oh, well, it's proof that there's There's substance to the story in that there is very, very early settlement up here. And about today, there's more archaeology than art or architecture in a way. Is this a familiar image to you? Because this is frequently, yeah. It's the Capitoline she-wolf because it's in a Capitoline museum. But this is thought to be a bronze that commemorates that with the suckling twins, and they're the she-wolf. And for a long time, it was thought to be an ancient work of art, that this is maybe by the Etruscans, who were very fine craftsmen. If you go to the Met, there's a good collection of Etruscan bronzes. But now they've subjected it to technology. It's a hollow cast bronze. And I said, Etruscans weren't doing hollow cast bronzes. And I said, no, this bronze probably dates to the 12th century CE, not 6th century BCE. But there is not yet full agreement. The twins clearly are not from the same time as the wolf. Can you see that they look much more lifelike and agile and plump and baby-like? And they're definitely Renaissance additions. But the story of this wonderful, kind wolf was widespread because this is a mosaic floor found in Northeast London of this very jaunty wolf with legs crossed and the two little children dangling down below. Now, Rubens, early in his career, went to Rome, as any really ambitious artist would, to see the antiquities and to see what was current in art at that time. And he saw the Capitoline she-wolf. He came back to Antwerp and he painted this. Was inspired by seeing that bronze. That's the river god, is the river Tiber. There they are at the mouth of the cave, and their shepherdess is just coming upon them. The children are to be discovered and reintegrated into society. What makes those holes come to life is awareness of objects like this. This is Etruscan, and it's a little bronze urn. It's for ashes. So someone was buried in this. But the shape of that, even in the roof, is early pre-use of stone building. This would be wood and thatch. There would just be those poles posted in the rock, and then the structure built up around it. In Greece, most places, buildings don't start out rectangular. They start out with curved walls. First of all, it's more stable and doesn't take the kind of architectural finesse. So this is on the Palatine, and this is a conjecture of what that little village looked like. So this is about 9th century BC. This we could say is a model of what the beginning of Rome would look like. So in this, you can see you're getting a view of a great big sort of like table model of the topography of Rome. So there's the Palatine. Then there's this Great Depression between that and the Capitoline. That's where the Forum is. And that was all a very marshy area. And it was about the 6th century that they drained that and made it habitable. And then this area coming down even lower, this Forum Boarium, that means a square for cattle. That's where cattle would be unloaded from the boats and where trade would go. So that's the sort of docking area. And these are, we think, the oldest areas in Rome where there was a developed society and developed civilization. it would be very typical of the culture to which the Romans belonged. When you go outside of Rome too, you find where people settle, it's common sense. They're on hills. So you just have a much better defensive position. You can see anybody coming and you can retreat to someplace. Now comes some more archaeology to supplement the pot bases that I was passing around. Still looking at the very earliest part of the city. This was from a surprise find. It's called the San Omobono area. That's because there's a church, a kind of an ugly church there, of San Omobono. He's the patron saint of tailors. But there was in the late 30s, they were going to construct a complex of government buildings here. And they started to dig and they began to find things underground. That's the peril of both Athens and Rome, and I suppose also Paris and London. You can't build. You just have the governments have archaeologists who stand by at sites, because the minute something is found that seems to be important, diggings has to cease while it's evaluated. So there's all sorts of like, oh no, we're not going to let people know that we found anything here. But this was discovered. And I think you can see, I'm not an archaeologist. I marvel at archaeology. I don't have the patience for it. I can't stand to be out in the heat like that. It's not for me. But you can see from the amount they've dug that it's different levels. In Rome, it's throughout. They sort of take part of the top of the building down, fill it up with dirt, and then build on top. So it's just rising like a cake, layer on layer on layer. As you look at it, you see there's quite a variety in stones. There's these big blocks, and then in some areas there are bricks, and toward the back there's some that are being held up. They're holding up a floor of another level. And archaeologists, because there are other things found around here, little terracotta figurines or bits of pots, things that can be dated, they can sort of figure out, well, this is the foundation of this kind of building and it's about this time. There's several temples, and then there's a written record that tells about them. And no, I might show them next time. I don't know. So it kind of verifies that this was a spot where there was it was a kind of a sacred or a protected by the gods area. How very typical. And then there's a church of San Omobono there throughout all the centuries, however the cultures change. Sacred spots stay sacred spots. You could see, and you're going to know a lot more about this in a few minutes, how much you have to work with, how many different kinds of walls. Well, walls can be dated by the technology. But one more from just digging in the site. As they went down, they got to this. This is probably 9th century BCE, the foundation of a very, very old temple. They haven't done more with that because you can see the measuring stick at the base there, and you see it's in sort of slop. It's below the water table. So excavation is extremely difficult and extraordinarily expensive. So only for a space of 3 days, the archaeological service, Rome's service, had steel panels put down around that shaft, and they sucked out the water, because the problem is that the soil, that wet soil, would just collapse in, cover the excavators, cover everything that was being found. So for just 3 days, they considered it was safe to go down and see that little bit, and then they've had to close it up. So you see how far down they are. But now Rome is well into this because they are doing what Athens has just recently done, which is to install a more extensive subway system. And the marvelous thing about subways is that they're deep underground. So ordinary excavators, by and large, don't go lower than 20 feet before ground level because it's simply too ambitious, too expensive. You can't, your desire to know the past cannot exceed the practical realities. But this is 65 feet down. So it's a chance for them to go way down to see what's going on in Rome. And they are working on what's Metro Line C, and which I think is going to have a couple dozen stations. And so they're working along. So this, is by the monument of Victor Emmanuel and the Forum. And this area, all this hodgepodge of walls you see down there, that is an apartment building. There's a lot more work to do, but at that level, that's an apartment building. And then this is near the Colosseum. This is Metro Line C, where a lot is being done. And in the stations, this also is true in Athens, the best of the finds they have that they're producing, they're exhibiting in the station stops. So the objects are staying there. And there's pottery on the wall here, and you can see part of course, a statue there. The Roman one.
Existing stations or
yeah,
not getting used?
This one is in use. Yeah. And you find objects at least as humble as what I brought in. These are Roman transport jars for wine. And you can date them because wine was taxed, and the tax, whoever had the job, had a stamp and would stamp on it. So you could say, oh, this is this year, this year, this year, this year. So where you find one of these, you know what things around it are roughly from that same period. And in one of the stops by the Colosseum, as they dug, they came to this, I think you can make sense out of. There's a series of small rooms with a corridor in between. There were found several skeletons and enough materials so that they can know what this was. This is a barracks, a military barracks for about 200 of the Emperor Hadrian's elite guards. Well, it was never known that the emperors allowed their troops to be stationed within Rome. The saying always was that they had to be outside the walls of the city. Well, no. So, and in a way more exciting than that is that as they found these walls, that's the level to which the walls had been taken down when building was to go on above it. So, and then it was filled with soil. And then they built on top of it. But what they found buried in the soil around those walls were wood. Now, you never find wood because wood is so impermanent in moisture. And it was the wood that was used, the formwork around building walls. So they tested the wood. It's oak wood. Okay, fine, it's oak wood. It's oak wood from France. So you have some idea of the expanse of the empire, even from something you'd think nice to have, but otherwise not so informative. And at one end, they found the commander's quarters. He had quite nice 14-room digs with frescoed walls and black and white pebble mosaic floors and a central courtyard. And here you're looking down at these. And that takes us to walls. Next time, you see why I had to show you that Baroque church to give you hope that you're going to get to something really lavish at some point. But the history of walls. And it's not just that I want to talk about things archaeological. The Romans themselves, in the Roman historians' writings that we have surviving, say, we are best at roads, water, engineering, and war. Leave the arts to the Greeks. They had a very strong sense of that was what they were. So you were going to be looking at walls and water and roads today. So you can date things if there are no coins around, no pots around, you can date just by the technology of the walls. These are the earliest, and they're called cyclopean because the earliest ones are from Greece. They're made with huge stones, and the Greeks said, oh, no human being could ever make something like that. It had to have been giants who put those blocks up because they are simply blocks. It's like Mayan architecture. They are blocks fitted against one another. There's no mortar. There's nothing holding them together. So how they lifted the rocks, we don't exactly know, but there's no particular production technology involved in that. And then around the 3rd century BCE, the Romans discovered cement. This is a hot topic now, and it is because cement, concrete, is the building material most used all around the world. And it's in its production, there are it's extremely polluting. I think the carbon, whatever, coming from this. So they're looking for something to do to improve the material. And Roman concrete has a feature that, say, cement, modern Portland cement doesn't have. Anything you build a concrete building now, 50, 60 years, and it begins to fall apart. It cracks, water gets in, begins to disintegrate. You know that big skyscraper in Manhattan, they're having issues with it now because its outer wall is extraordinarily needle high, building with gorgeous white exterior. The facade is collapsing. The Roman seems to be impervious to water. There are Roman harbors where, of course, the walls are being battered by water all the time. 2,000 years old, not a crack. American concrete one, modern concrete one, they figure 50 years. So they're trying to discover just exactly what did they do? What was the magic? And Harvard, MIT has a team. There's several teams of scientists trying to discover how it was made. So this is an early cement wall by them, just made by rubble. And then there's lime and the ash. It's ash, it's called Pozzolano. It's from the area of the Bay of Naples. It's volcanic ash, which we know the Romans thought to be extremely valuable for building because they shipped it all through the empire. And there had at one time been a volcanic area not too far from Rome. So you can get some there too. So there's this kind of wall, but that's not particularly attractive. But they're studying that. And what they're finding here is the bright red spot. That's the one that in the article I was reading had it. What they're discovering in these walls are little bits of lime, just little white chunks of lime. It's like, and it had been dismissed for a long time. Well, they just didn't mix it well. You know, they're careless. They didn't know what they were doing. But now they found that this is the Harvard team anyway, if water gets into those little pieces of lime, it will then begin to expand so that the wall becomes self-healing. So what has been disparaged as a sign of their, well, they were earlier than us and what could they have known, was actually something that we are only now discovering. But most walls were covered. And there's a sequence in the way they were covered. And we're going to go from left to right. Opus insertum, insertums just inserted. So the core of the wall is just that concrete. And then put all over it are small stones. There's a slightly more decorative facing. Now, this wouldn't take any particular trained workforce to put this up. You just have small blocks and you fit them in one next to another. But then they proceeded to instead have either cut blocks of stone. So you've gone to the work of cutting them, and they're square on the exterior, and then they're sort of pyramidal shape. The point goes into the wall. It's called a reticulated wall, like a net pattern. They say, actually, this took less training than the preceding one, because before you couldn't have many people working on it at once, because you'd have to be picking up a stone and fitting it in here, and an assistant could maybe hand you rocks, say, is this one going to fit this? But you have to work very slowly. If you have something that's all the same size, you can have different people working all the way down the wall. I'm doing my section, you're doing your section. I'm working on one side of the wall, you're working on the other. It's uniform. And then they move on to what we still call Roman bricks, the particular shape of the bricks. So that's 1st and 2nd century. There are a lot of Roman wealthy matrons whose fortune came from owning brick factories. And this also could be done with teamwork. And you see just the rough concrete core into which you could put those 2 bits of dishes that I just passed around. You could put anything. You could put leftover stone. You just need the bulk. You don't even need the weight or anything, really. So junk goes in the walls. And then finally there's opus mixtum. It just means mixed, where there's brick and something else. As the fortunes of Rome waned and they were making less bricks, they're making the bricks go further by having just a few courses of bricks, and then something else, then a few more courses of bricks. So now you can go through the countryside, and if you find a Roman ruin, you can just dazzle anybody by saying, well, this is from around this period or that period, because you can tell from the walls. And the aqueducts. This is a painting by Thomas Cole, the American landscape painter, who made 2 trips to Rome. And they're an extremely impressive remain. Who here has seen, of course, they're not all just in Italy, but in Spain, see the aqueducts too. Yeah. France, yep. There's now outside Rome a park that's just called the Park of the Aqueducts. Rome had 11 different aqueducts. This is how they could have such a large city population. And it was they had wonderful supply of water, because they had drinking water, bathing water. They had, that some of you probably know that the Colosseum, they could flood and have mock naval battles. And they built other structures that are called naumachia. I mean, there were places where they had naval battles. So they brought in the water for that. So it was just copious water. And they'd say, oh, the water from this one aqueduct is the best with wine, it's the coldest, the freshest water. The longest aqueduct now known as 61 miles, which is a considerable distance. They were making them from around the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. And when those huge bath buildings were built in Rome, they'd extend the aqueduct to get the water to them. So you can see here this is a 18th century map. You can see the walls around the city and then within the arcades of the aqueducts. So I think of aqueducts myself in terms like the Thomas Cole painting or those wonderful arcades across the countryside, but most aqueducts are underground, which only makes sense because anything above ground is available for sabotage, is available for pollution, is available for people stealing the water. So the aqueducts are only when you have to go across some kind of a depression, or if you have a huge hill. If you can maintain the steady gradient from whatever your source of water is, a spring or river, they would prefer to go around the mountain with a tunnel rather than tunnel through. I mean, they avoided aqueducts on arcades as much as possible. But I'll show you some from there. This is actually in Arizona, Colorado, in the 30s. This is just showing the way they were built underground. So we had one here. And this is a Roman one. You could actually drive a wagon through there. And from as you go along, there are manholes, so you could go down in there and repair them. And there are rooms off to the side where workers could be. So this would be the more typical nature of the aqueducts. Anybody who has ever been around me has to have seen this, because I always revert to the same image about the use of the arches, the Roman round arches, how they could build. If the water is not going too far and they don't have to, the depression is not so great, they would build a wall and you could just run it along the top of the wall. But they would only take a wall about 20 feet high. Beyond that, they moved to the arches that we think of. And the arches here, each one is holding the one next to it up. And then the final ones go into the ground. So all the force goes into the ground. So as long as they're round arches like this. Pont de Garde in Nîmes is the best preserved bridge. And then there's an aqueduct across the top. But if you look carefully at this, you see the nature of the round arch, because the span right over the water, if you look at the middle level, that arch actually starts lower to the ground, to the like road level than the ones next to it, because it has a slightly wider diameter. So that arch is rising higher. Well, they're not going to make it rise up and make the bulge in the thing. They have to start it lower to accommodate that height. So with their technology, well, how are they building them? This concept of what sort of crane they used has some basis in reality. Not that they've, to my knowledge, discovered a crane yet, but there is a relief carved on a Roman citizen's tomb that shows building with a crane. And so there's a crane right there, and you see how the wheel is turned. This is true through Gothic architecture. It's by manpower. You stand in it. It's like, the gerbils in the wheel. And it's also terribly dangerous, because if what you're carrying drops and it goes backward, it's a casualty for almost everybody who's in there. But this is all slave labor. And there's the modern reconstruction of it. This is the building material that was so very important, of which we had none, and that's rope. They knew a lot about rope. They were sailors. Everything came to them, lots of things. All their grain came across from the Mediterranean by ship. And then this is the new park. It's just called the Park of the Aqueducts. This is actually 3 different aqueducts, one on top of another, made at different stages. And because they're just nice to look at, a couple of in the countryside views, some arches. So that's it for aqueducts. We're not through with water. I only have 3 images, I think, for this. Sewers. This is the Cloaca Maxima. So in the 6th century, when the Romans drained, it was, I mean, no one else was doing this, like really draining land to make it habitable for them. So they mastered their world. At first, they probably just made a channel and lined it with brick. And so that took rainwater, trash water, and out into the Tiber. And then at some point, we don't know when, they covered it over and began to use it as we would now, as sort of a mixed sewer and rainwater collection. And this is a part of it that's still in use in Rome. So
The 6th century BC.
that's when they first, yes, they first started. And this was, as you could imagine, repaired, added on to, and changed by over the centuries by the rulers. And you see it in a painting by a Danish artist of the 19th century. It's at in the depression there that you see at the center, lower center. And other ruins evocative there toward the back. And roads. Well, that's how this is like what you learn in early Latin, right? Their roads made it possible for them to have good mail service, good military service, just fast and efficient communication. And this is an early road, and this is the first military road. It's the Via Appia, which is lined by graves, which you can still see along there. And the very obvious remnant of the truth of how uncomfortable it must have been to ride on anything wheeled, because they had metal wheels. Yeah. And this road cuts through the countryside. This was started in the 3rd century BC by political major governmental figure, who also oversaw the construction of the first aqueduct going into Rome. Anyway, enormous uproar in the Senate, the waste of public money. How can we have something like this? It's very familiar stories. Now, I don't know where this road is, but you could see the complexity of the way they are made. There are multiple layers of heavy stones and then smaller stones and then layers of sand in between. And they're graded so they slope so that the water goes to either side. And they have curbing on them. They're just extraordinary.
That's from when?
I don't know because I couldn't find exactly where this one is. This is not near Rome. I think it just happens to be, my guess would be like England, but I'm not sure. When I say guess, I mean guess. So in this drawing, you can see how many layers there are working on it. It says again about the extreme complexity of this. I know what I have one small quote. This is by one of Rome's water commissioners who wrote really nicely. He's an engineer and a military man and government man, a man named Frontinus. And he wrote a book. But this is what he said. With such an array of indispensable structures, this is still just about the aqueducts, carrying so many waters, compare, if you will, the pyramids or the useless though famous works of the Greeks. But so they know full well that they are the rivals of the two great ancient cultures, but on their own grounds, which is technology. Oh, so uncomfortable. And then the only other, unbelievably how this is going to work out for time, bit of technology in next session, look at some of the great monuments of ancient Rome. And then following week after that will be early Christian Rome, and then we'll get to medieval Rome, and then we'll get to Renaissance and Baroque Rome. But that's the walls around Rome. So we go back to that founding myth of Romulus, that he dug a perimeter, a trough, saying within here, this is the territory under the protection of the gods. This is the city, and out beyond that is just land. Rome did fall to the Etruscans in the beginning of the 4th century and BCE. And after that, they built a wall. And that's what's in the red outline here. It doesn't include all of what we would consider ancient Rome. What's called the Field of Mars there, that's where everyone is salivating that there should be any possibility of doing digging, because we know there are extremely important buildings down under there somewhere. But there are a few blocks of this wall, which date probably to the beginning of the 3rd century BCE. I mean, it was, the name Servian goes to one of those mythical early kings, like as oh, this is much older than that, but it wasn't. They're just massive blocks of tuff. It's TUFF. It is volcanic rock. And this is just outside the Termini railroad station. And I haven't been there in too many decades, but I read that there are some blocks of this in the McDonald's in the station. And here's near a section.
That mortar, is there a mortar?
No. So this is like this would be, they're cut blocks, so they're not just rough rocks like the Cyclops picked up, but and it rose to max 30 feet. And there was a ditch on either side. So after the Etruscans had sacked the city, they decided to put up a defense, and they built this wall. And then when they had conquered all the rest of the Mediterranean, they had no more need of a defensive wall. And it wasn't, and the city just grew on beyond that. Fortunately, they didn't tear it down. And it wasn't until 270 in the Christian era, when the Germanic tribes were again coming down and threatening Rome, that they built another wall. That's called the Aurelian Wall. The emperor at that time was Aurelian. And that's the wall in red. And you see it even crosses the Tiber. So it's protecting that harbor area, that most important area on both sides.
More than double the size.
Mhm. And here's, it has been added on to, or altered, not added in length, but the walls have been since standing all the time since then, throughout the centuries that they've been, new ramparts have been added, new defenses added onto it. And so you just go around the city and there's the wall. You just walk through the wall. This was yeah.
You know, it's interesting, when you travel to other parts of Europe, like I was in England a couple of years ago, and you see the walls there, the Roman walls there, and you can walk on them, you got the arches, just like that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do they came up with a good design that worked, and then they just imported it everywhere?
Where they went, sure.
Or do they keep improving, or do they just stick with basic design?
Oh, I think what they had is just such engineering skill. And they would have, you know, from their experience, they would bend it to however much they needed it for the site. They didn't have to import new materials for it or anything. Yeah. So this is called the Porta Maggiore. And this was, the Aurelian wall was just built to add into, because it's a wall. Oh, why not? If you had something big standing there, they incorporated it into the walls. And this one was actually originally had an aqueduct that went across the top. That's why it's so high. There was a water channel going through there. And this is what it looked like in the 16th century. I thought you should see what the rising ground level does from that to this. And Rome was reviving by the 16th century. In the later Middle Ages, it was a small place. And this is a late 19th century photograph. And this is essentially for, oh, these are the Romans. I send you out this odd honeycombed structure there. That's a tomb for a freedman. Now, Roman slavery is different from, unfortunately, the slavery we know in our own heritage, because Roman slaves were, well, not all of them, but many of them were people who had been taken captive in war. And if you were very skilled in something, you could, or very kind, you could buy your freedom. And there are, so then you're a freedman, and you could make a fortune. And this is the tomb that looks like an oven of a man who was a baker, who made a fortune as a baker. And this is parvenu. See, the Romans didn't have big things like, oh, look at me, I got this, but right by the walls, he has this. And at the top, a little relief showing people manufacturing bread and selling it. So on that very human note of like, I'm proud of my accomplishments and you should enjoy it too. I'll leave you till next week and then we'll look at the grand monuments. Oh, of course, always, I forget, now it's all over, right? So she knew to ask questions. Anytime you have a question or comment, please butt in.
Could you repeat the question so that we can hear it?
Remind me to, yeah, and yeah, I will repeat questions if you remind me to. Goodbye. Trick or treat. Okay, what?
The aqueduct.
Yeah. What about
It has to be
that?
constantly going downhill, right?
Yeah.
So how deep did it have to go when it got to the end of the city or wherever it was gonna be? They dig down that far.
When I come to the city,
Here's a question for the Zoom people.
I believe all the aqueducts, when they come into the city, they're coming above ground. Because remember, Rome down there is that low spot in the Tiber. So these are all water sources that are flowing down. So they come into the city on that. Yes,
Wall.
yes.
Those things, the stones and things that they're putting on the wall. Was that to help make it stronger, or was it just decoration? Because they could have just left it like ruleless.
Well,
flat concrete. You mean the bricks? Yeah, the bricks or the stones or those, where
no one, what do I know? And I only know what I said. And it's assumed that they're always covered. So there must have been something other than just, if you go to Pompeii, it's always covered too. It has to be it's probably both. I'm thinking both.
And
Yes.
when they were stamping the wine
Yeah.
vessels with the dates, what year were they using? Because back then, they didn't know that they were in BC.
Oh, you have to be scholar, you see, you have to be a
Were they using?
Roman historian or scholar. There are lists. No, it's under my consulship or under this, and we know we have lists of who had what office in what year. That's how we can date Roman coins too, because the different denominations, whoever puts out the coin puts his own image on it. So we know. Okay, any more? I hope we see a lot of you next week. Oh, yeah. What?
The state park in Rockford, Massachusetts, that is a quarry from the 1800s. I made the sidewalks to New York. And you can see the demonstration of how they cut the bricks and what was so involved in hand-cutting bricks. So this is, you think the size of this and what it takes to each brick. It's really amazing.
It's sometimes said about Rome, especially in Imperial Rome, that almost everybody there was dependent on the government, that their employment came from construction. A lot of it is construction. Yeah.
More thing.
Yes.
The she-wolf. I
Yes.
heard in another class.
Yes.
That it was really a mistranslation. And that it really was a prostitute. Baby. It's not a little more realistic, but not quite.
Well, okay, so I have one to add that I also forgot about the story of Romulus and Remus. Think how many cultures have in the back at their origin stories of a conflict between brothers. Think of Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob, and I think there's Arcadian myths. I mean, it's quite outside the biblical religions. It's just way back.
The artifacts that were on display, the Soviet station.
Yeah.
Station was
Yeah, Termini.
in Germany.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, goodbye.